Order now, and welcome to the 133rd meeting of the Standing Committee of Public Accounts of the House of Commons.
In hybrid format, pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room and possibly remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to ask all members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent any audio feedback incidents. Veuillez garder à l'esprit les mesures.
Please bear in mind what has been put in place to protect the health of all participants, including the interpreters.
Pieces that are in front of you. Keep your earpiece away from all microphones at all times. And when not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the sticker on the table for this purpose. It could be just to the right of you or just to the left. In Mr. Green's case, welcome, Mr. Green. The sticker. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Conformément à l'article 108.3G du règlement,
Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3G, the committee is resuming its consideration of Report 6, Technologies of Sustainable Development, Canada 2024, the 5 to 7 reports of the Auditor General in particular. This is number 6.
Karen Hogan, Auditor General Canada. Nice to see you and your team here today, along with Mathieu Lequin, Principal, and Eva Josina, Director. Lequin, je pense, plutôt. And from Sustainable Development Technology Canada, Paul Booth, Chair, Board of Directors. Thank you for joining us today, along with Cheryl Uri, Vice President, Finance. You'll each be given a 5-minute opening statement. I understand we're going to start, as we normally do, with the Auditor General, who I understand will make a statement, but it will just be a brief statement, relatively speaking. Over to you, Ms. Hogan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As the committee members know, I appeared last week on this report. At that time, I read an opening statement onto the record. It was comprehensive. It included our findings about not only Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, but also the Sustainable Development Technology Foundation. So I really have nothing more to add on opening remarks, and in order to better support the committee, I give you back the rest of my 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll take full advantage of that. Mr. Booth, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul Booth. I'm a retired Deputy Minister and Public Finance Professor living in Dundas, Ontario. I'm joined here by Cheryl Uri, as you heard, the Vice President Finance at SDTC. I thank you for allowing her to participate in the place of our acting CEO, Mr. Ziad Rahmeh, who has an important family commitment this afternoon. Mr. Chair, on June 4th, the Governor and Council appointed me as the Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology. Quite a mouthful. With a term of 1 year. I was appointed to the board along with 2 other retired deputy ministers, Cassie Doyle and Marta Morgan. On the same day, the Auditor General released her report number 6 on Sustainable Development Technologies Canada, and the Minister of Industry also released a report by the law firm McCarthy Tétrault on HR practices at the Foundation. In addition, on June 4th, it was a busy day, the Minister of Industry announced a new direction for governance of the Foundation, with the Foundation's programming and staff to be transferred to the National Research Council. Further, the Minister announced that the Foundation's funding to clean technology startups would recommence forthwith. I'm here today, or I hope that today, in answer to your questions, I can share with you what we intend to do as the new board of the Foundation to restart funding and to plan and execute the transfer of the programming and staff to the NRC. Before I do, however, I want you to know that the new Board of Directors accepts the recommendations of the Auditor General. In recommencing our funding of clean technology startups, we will be guided by her report as we update our practices related to record keeping and the management of conflicts of interest. Further, we will work with the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development to ensure that the contribution agreement fully reflects the government's intended purpose for the funding we disperse, and we will ensure that all future funding decisions are fully compliant with the terms of the contribution agreement. Although we are only on day 13 of our new mandate as the Board of Directors, we have been working hard to understand the Foundation's work and its operations and the recommendations of the Auditor General's report. Foundation staff have been working diligently to develop a concrete plan to address the concerns expressed by the Auditor General. I'm confident that we'll be able to successfully accomplish the objectives of restarting the funding in a manner consistent with the recommendations of the Auditor General and planning and implementing the transfer of the Foundation's programming and the staff to the National Research Council. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for that opening statement. We now begin our first round. Each of the next 4 members will have 6 minutes each. Mr. Perkins, we begin with you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. I think I'll begin my questioning with Ms. Yuri. I'm going to start with a quick little summary. In 2019, the Prime Minister's hand-picked chair for the SDTC, which the public knows as the Green Slush Fund, came in after SDTC had gotten a clean governance audit in 2017 from, I believe, both Treasury Board and the Auditor General. It seems to me like the culture of the organization changed quite a bit, and we've had testimony here that it changed too. The concept that Minister Baines and his office had said to manage conflicts. And so we have a number of directors who ended up doing transactions that end up, according to the Auditor General's report, almost half of all transactions from 2017 to 2023 were conflicted transactions out of the 420, which is quite an amazing thing because I don't believe those directors represented more than half of the green technology sector. Yet somehow they managed to get almost half the funding when you combine the 90 that were undeclared conflicts, the 96 that were declared conflicts, and the $58 million of money spent outside the terms of the contribution agreement. And you were, I believe, the finance person all this time. And we had the Deputy Minister here last week, and he agreed that in a lot of cases, in some of these cases, the money should be paid back because it went in an inordinate number and outside to these directors and outside, in many cases, of the limit set out by Parliament to where it should be spent. Has the minister, the Liberal minister today of Industry, directed you, both the current acting chair and you as finance director, have they directed you to seek any of this money back?
Thank you for the question, and I would say, as you know, I think that we responded to the recommendations of the Auditor General. We accept the findings of the report, and
that in the statement. I have limited time. Please answer the question directly. Yes or no, have you been asked by the government to seek any of this money back or start the process for that? Yes or no?
Well, consistent with what Deputy Minister had said last week, we are looking at the projects within the portfolio to assess the criteria of eligibility, ensure the projects were eligible. Should we find any instances where projects are ineligible,
So that's a no.
we would work forward.
The government
to seek
hasn't asked you to
recovery.
seek the money back.
I believe that it was sought within the response to the Auditor General's report.
Well, I'm looking for you as the finance person to tell me whether the government has said that, not what the deputy said in his testimony. Has the government since then asked you to get the money back?
I believe the Deputy Minister would have been responding to the Auditor General's report where we said we would recover any funds that need to be recovered.
Responding to, I was here in the meeting, I wish you would answer the question. You are an officer of an organization that received $1 billion of taxpayer money. I will go on to my next question. One of the things that the Auditor General raised is this issue of these funds that are outside of the contribution agreements and legal limits. While you were CFO, the seed fund, as it's called, was set up. Who directed you to open up a fund that was outside of the contribution agreements?
So thank you for your question, and I would kind of direct you again to the response to the Auditor General's report. And
the Auditor General's report and response, it lays no clarity, doesn't say who ordered you and the management team to set up funds that were outside of the contribution agreement.
I would say, to my knowledge, there was no direction from within the department or from the minister's office.
So they
regarding
mythically
setting up
appeared
a
from the
seed fund.
board? Was it the board that did it, the hand-picked Liberal appointees? And the reason I ask is because you could not apply directly if you were a green technology fund to the seed fund. Is that correct? You couldn't apply to SDTC. You had to go through another body. What did SDTC call those other bodies that you had to apply for through to get money for the seed fund? What were they called?
So to understand our funding process, there's a requirement to always have a partner to be able to participate in your project.
I'm not looking for an explanation of
And the
funding
partners
partner.
within our seed funding stream, they'd be called accelerators,
They
and
were
they're distributed
accelerators.
across the
So
country.
the accelerators vetted the applications. You couldn't direct it. Now, the accelerators included the Fisherian Center, correct?
Correct.
And the Fisherian set up by the board.
Et donc cet organisme est dirigé par le président du Conseil. Et puis nous avons donc à Toronto.
Point of order. My apologies.
Yes, interpreters' apologies. Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you.
We will look to the French translation was coming through on the English. How are you hearing it right now? It's okay. Got it. That's why.
I tried to get their attention, but it didn't work.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Perkins, you've got just over 40 seconds left.
So the board chair's center had to vet the money, and it recommended companies that she had a financial interest in. Mars. Annette Fisherian chaired Mars. That was one of the accelerators that approved stuff, correct?
I would say that, yes, all
Yes,
accelerators
okay.
across the country, and the
Founder
seed
Fuel,
funding program began.
Founder Fuel was owned by, as an accelerator in Quebec, owned by another board member, Andre Lise-Matteau. Is that correct?
I'm not confident that that's an accelerator. I don't
It's
know.
on the accelerator list.
There's over 80, and I don't know the names of them all.
Well, it's here. I can assure you that for this fund, which almost all the funds appear to have gone to conflicted businesses outside of the government's terms of the use of this money, was filtered through these accelerators controlled by these two board members.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. We'll come back to you, I'm sure. Ms. Khalid, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Yuri, I know the Conservative member, Mr. Perkins, asked a whole bunch of questions. I didn't exactly give you any opportunity to answer many of them, so just wondering if you wanted to add something to what the previous questioner.
Sure. So I think a large amount of the focus on the previous questions was around our seed funding stream. And so the seed funding stream was a stream that was envisaged to be able to provide funding across the country to smaller communities and to entrepreneurs that weren't usually able to access different pools of funding within the government. And so this seed funding stream sought out partners from across the country, in Newfoundland, PEI. We'd never received applications from some of these regions. And so that was really the purpose of the seed funding stream. And it was envisioned prior to the previous chair joining the board. And so what this program has, I think, enabled for SDTC is we've increased the number of women entrepreneurs that have been funded through the SDTC funds, and we've also enabled them to be able to graduate to a larger fund and perhaps be able to access larger pools of funding, government funding that's available, I think, to many entrepreneurs across the country, but these kind of smaller entrepreneurs haven't had the opportunity to access this funding.
Thank you for that. And do you think that the program is successful? Is it reaching its objectives?
Unequivocally, I believe across government, the seed funding program has been deemed successful in accelerating some of these small businesses that generally haven't had the opportunity to, I think, have the support, because it's not just funding support that you receive, you also receive greater connection to the ecosystem, to have other supports, mentors within your own sector. And so, yes, it's been seen as a great success.
So when we see conservative messaging of such programs being referred to as the Green Sludge Fund or whatever it is, how do you think that impacts the credibility of an organization like that?
It's difficult for, I think, SDTC and its employees to hear that type of messaging delivered when we see some of the companies that have come through our portfolio and have been able to provide, I think, an incredible amount of jobs and contributed to environmental benefits across the country, and all Canadians are benefiting from this. And so for us, it's a bit of a challenge, for sure.
Thank you. And Mr. Booth, I'll just turn to you. What is your role now in this transitional board, and how do you see the organization going forward?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, my role is chair of the board, but this is a board of 3 equals, all former deputy ministers. You know, in terms of our priorities, we have 3 priorities. When I was a deputy minister, we told our ministers that they should only have 3 priorities, and so I think we have the right number. I mean, my priorities are implement the Auditor General's report, restart the funding, and plan and implement the transfer to the National Research Council. So we have divided the work among ourselves, and one of my colleagues will focus mostly on planning the transition. Another will focus mostly on the
Sorry, I'm just
did
going
I
to
say
pause you
restart the
right
funding?
there for a
oh,
second.
yes, the transition. The other will do the restart the funding.
I pause for a quick second. Chair, I can literally hear my conservative colleagues whispering so loud that I can't hear the witness. So if you can, please, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ms. Khalid. You have 2 minutes left.
And then my main focus will be implementing the Auditor General's report. So that's how we're dividing the work.
Thank you for that. And to Ms. Hogan, what do you think of the new transitional infrastructure, and what challenges do you think that the organization will face?
It's difficult for me to comment on how the transition's been set up and the appointment of the board members, since I don't know any of the details around that. I think when I think about where it will ultimately end up, which is in a federal department, I believe that will increase accountability and transparency around the use of funds, that it will help eliminate some of the potential conflicts of interest that currently exist between board members needing to be experts in the field. I guess one of the concerns that I will have then is how will the National Research Council ensure that they have the expertise to do what was happening at the board, right? Making sure that the projects were really innovative and new technology, making sure that they would actually contribute to better water, better clean air, and reducing climate change. So I think while it will help in some respects, there's another risk that's present, and I hope that the National Research Council will make sure that they have that expertise as they evaluate, based on merit, what every project should receive or not.
I really appreciate you talking about the ethics of it all, because I do think that that's really important. So can you perhaps explain the nature of potential ethics violations or conflicts of interest that would arise in an organization like this? I know we saw through the pandemic when companies were paid out. Like, how does that translate into the reality and the perception of accountability and transparency in government institutions like this?
I think if you start with a foundational sort of element is that a person should not be seen to benefit from public funds. And there's a requirement in the Sustainable Development Technology Act that says that no one should personally benefit from government money. When the act also then requires that board members have expertise in the field. And so with that just comes the natural inherent nature that there will be a conflict of interest. The clean tech industry is a small one. And so if you want some of the expertise, it's likely that they're also trying to develop and innovate. And that's why the need for a really rigorous process to say if you've declared a conflict of interest, that you do the right thing and recuse yourself from the votes and the discussions.
And thank you very much. That is the time. Suivant, c'est Madame.
Next, Madame Sinclair de Gagné.
À vous, Madame Sinclair, pour 6 minutes.
6 minutes, Madame Sinclair de Gagné. Thank you very much, Chair. I do have a question, a direct one for the Auditor General. How do you determine the time horizon for the study? You started April 2017. Why did you choose that date? We chose the breadth of the study based on the last time that we did it, when the Commissioner for Sustainable Development was studied in 2017. So in his audit, then was conflict of interest looked at? No, in 2017, we looked at projects that would, in actual fact, benefit the environment. Yes. Because if you look a little further beyond 2017, it would seem that there were cases of conflict of interest that were very interesting. Enerchem, Madame Méthode was on the board of directors at that time for Enerchem while being on another. And Enerchem received the largest part, the lion's share of the funding that was available for projects. I don't see it in your report, though. That report was finished in March 31st, 2017. It wasn't included then in your report, but I think it's of interest. I do have it here. $63,600,000 was the amount in question. When she was on the evaluation or assessment committee while being on the board. So a question for you, Ms. Yuri. When you spoke to my colleague here answering a question about recovering funds, have you assessed all the projects? This is a question we asked Mr. Kennedy several times last week, and we want to know what's going to be happening. You've got this team that's going to be moving over to NRC. But we want to know, looking at the projects, were they all eligible? How were the firms hired? So tell me, how did you assess them?
So as it stands right now, consistent with the recommendations in the Auditor General's report, we've committed to reassess the eligibility of the portfolio of projects that we have, and so that would be done prior to any transition to the National Research Council. And there will be a third party that would be engaged to be able to conduct this work, and the criteria for eligibility will be laid out very clearly. There'll be a commentary on how each project that was approved by the SDTC board would have met the eligibility criteria, and if the eligibility criteria have not been met, and it's at that point in time when recovery would be considered.
Vous avez dit tous les projets, mais ce sont...
You said all projects. Are they projects that are current, that are underway, or are they projects that have been finished?
Currently, we're starting with all projects that are underway, the active portfolio of projects. It's a significant number of projects just as the active portfolio of projects. So in order to manage the workload, those are the projects that we're starting with. It's over 100 projects.
Mais allez-vous éventuellement regarder aussi les projets?
But are you also going to look at the ones that have been completed? NRCan, for example, received public funds from the city of Edmonton, but did not deliver any public service at all. It got funding from SDTC as well. So no objective was met. It was really a sinkhole for public funding. So can you reassure Canadians and Quebecers that funds for projects that are so-called completed, will you be able to recover those funds?
So unfortunately, I can't speak about a specific project without having kind of more details in
Je
front
parle
of
des
me.
projets
However,
passés.
yeah, however,
I'm speaking about past projects.
for past projects, those projects are still under consideration as well. We don't have a full roadmap kind of to the end of transition at this point in time. As we said, Dr. Booth has just joined the
En ce qui
organization.
a trait à la transition,
Now, with respect to the transition, once again, Mr. Kennedy last week told us that funding for projects that were underway were, I think that if these projects are under study, we have to know if they are truly eligible or not. So then how can Mr. Kennedy tell us that funding will in actual fact resume soon? Are you going to hold on to the funds until you can be sure that they were eligible, or are you just going to keep funding, keep the flow going for current projects?
No. So thank you for the question. And again, as it relates to eligibility, we need to go through the process of reassessing eligibility for the active projects prior to dispersing funds. I think we're fortunate we have a little step up from the Auditor General's report. They would have sampled a pool of projects and they've already considered them eligible. But going forward, the rest of the portfolio.
Petite rapide.
Thank you. When do you think you'll be able to start again for the eligible projects? I'm asking the question on behalf of some businesses that are in fact eligible, but which unfortunately at this time are facing, because of the scandal that surrounds SDTC, are really in abeyance.
No, I appreciate the comment. We feel that every day in dealing with our portfolio companies and trying to ensure that they're getting the funding that they need to continue operating. And we are moving as quickly as we can to reassess the projects, but that needs to be done in advance of dispersing funds.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant, Mr. Green, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I want to begin just by an overall framing. Ms. Hogan, I believe I heard you state that benefiting from public dollars is a conflict of interest. Is that correct?
I think that's a fundamental rule, that if you're involved in a public organization, you should not be seen to be personally benefiting from public funds.
Would that include your family?
So I think it depends how you're going to frame it. Every case is a case that needs to be evaluated on its own merit.
In your overall findings, you found that the foundation poorly managed conflicts of interest, where the foundation's records showed the conflict of interest policies were not followed in 90 cases. Specifically, you identified the spouse of one of the foundation's senior managers was a partner at a human resources firm that was recruiting that the foundation used to support its process to appoint directors. The senior manager declared a perceived conflict of interest to the then CEO, and the board was only made aware of the perceived conflict of interest, as I understand, about a year later, despite the situation relating to board appointments. So to be clear and on the record, does that framing to you capture the current acting CEO, Zaid Ram's, hiring of his own wife to recruit board members that subsequently gave Mr. Zaid his bonuses and also selected him as the acting CEO after the previous CEO resigned? Is that accurate?
So if I may, Mr. Chair, there's just one clarity I'd like to provide. The 90 cases were not linked to this. The example that the member is talking about are cases that we highlighted where there are other
Specific
instances
to the
that
hiring of his wife, who would then be responsible for appointing the directors, who would then be responsible for his oversight.
So I'm getting to those were other instances that we felt the conflict of interest policy for the foundation just did not address. In our view, this is a risk. While it wasn't directly linked to funding, it was definitely a conflict of interest that should have been declared, and the board should have been made aware of it sooner. Yes.
In all the projects that you reviewed, did you find any funding applications that were approved without having the appropriate supporting documentation, such as project details, milestones, or completed budget?
When we concluded that there were 10 projects that were ineligible, 2 were clearly the seed funding because we felt it did not comply at all with the contribution agreement. But the remaining 8 were cases where the file just didn't support why these projects were eligible. So, without that evidence there, it's difficult for us to conclude that they were eligible.
And were you able to cross-reference those files with the files that were identified through having potential conflicts of interest?
We did, and I know that there, I believe, is 2 where there's a crossover. It's actually quite complicated. There are the conflicts of interest crossover, double up in instances, but there were definitely at least 2 projects that we deemed were ineligible that were cases where a conflict of interest had been declared and a person continued to vote.
Thank you. Did you come across instances where the board bulk approved a set of project applications without proper documentation being presented or reviewed by the board?
So I think I would describe 2 instances there, which we believe do not follow the contribution agreement. The contribution agreement is clear that funding should always be given based on merit project by project. So it would have been the seed stream of projects and then the COVID payments where it was a batch approval that we believe should not have been done that way. It violated the contribution agreement between the government
Certainly,
and the
Ms. Yuri would recall, I sat on the cross-examination, I think, that ultimately discovered that the chair of the board was receiving COVID payments, hadn't recused himself, has since stepped down. Is it also safe to say that in these instances that were bulk approved without proper documentation, that there was also an overlap with the conflict of interest that you identified in the cases?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was about 60 some odd cases, 63, I'm going to look for the number, 63 cases of COVID payments that were in conflict of interest. And then later on that the way the COVID payments were approved did not follow the contribution agreement. So there's two things at play with those payments.
And not coming into, like, the contribution agreement would also trigger things like financial compliance. Is that correct?
The contribution agreement between the federal government and the foundation really sets out how they should determine eligibility. And
It's just, if I could, I only have a minute left. There would have to be a need, correct?
they would have to demonstrate that it's a new technology
Right.
that is innovative, and that there would be environmental benefits that were tangible to the Canadian population.
Did you come across any cases where executives brought forward board-related projects that had been rejected by reviewers on multiple occasions, yet still moved forward for a second or third time with a new reviewer?
If you permit me, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to ask Mathieu to answer that.
If he could in a yes or no, if he knows, yes, if he doesn't, yes, okay. Are you confident then, knowing this, knowing all the conflicts, knowing all the ways in which bulk approvals happen at the board level, conflicted with board members, are you confident that all applications were treated fairly and evaluations and approval processes were consistent across all applications?
So I guess it comes back to how we did our sampling. We did a statistical sample because we couldn't sample all projects that were available. We looked at those in the allegations, and those are separate. But in our statistical sample, we felt that there was enough errors that meant at least 1 in 10 projects in the streams that remain are likely also ineligible, which is why we made the recommendation that it isn't just the 10 we found. You need to do more work to determine if there are others.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Beginning our second round, Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Yuri, can you confirm that SDTC is abiding by the order of the House of Commons and turning over all of its records to the RCMP.
So my understanding is SDTC did receive an order from the House of Commons, and we're in the process of collecting the documents that have been required and requires
Documents will be turned over within 30 days of that order, correct?
The intention is to turn over,
No.
the plan is to turn over all the documents to the law clerk as has been requested.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, you found in your damning report $76 million that went out the door in which board members at SDTC sat on, deliberated on, voted on the funneling out the door of those monies to companies that they had an interest in blatant conflicts of interest, blatant corruption. You provided this committee with a list of the board members and the companies that received those monies. One board member, Andre Lise-Mateau, who is a former colleague and longstanding friend of the Minister of the Environment, Mr. Guilbeault, received over $50 million, her companies, in funding from SDTC while she sat on the board, but she voted on. I have identified a number of other companies that Ms. Mateau has an interest in that received monies from SDTC while Ms. Mateau served on the board. So I want to ask you, did you look into the funding received by MindSense Technologies Limited, which received $4 million from SDTC, in which Ms. Mateau is an investor?
So, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure I can respond at that granular level. I'll see if the team can do some research. I think it's important to know that we didn't target board members or their companies. We looked at the process that the foundation had in place, and at times there were conflicts of interest that were well managed, and we highlighted the 90 that were not.
Well, Ms. Hogan, I would note that it is a blatant conflict of interest to, as you determined, to sit in a meeting and approve funding to a company that you have an interest in, and there were at least more than $50 million that went out the door that you've identified with respect to Ms. Mateau. And not only that, but it is a violation of the law for a board member to receive funding to a company that they have an interest in from SDTC by virtue of the SDTC Act. So we're not only talking about conflicts of interest, but we're also talking about non-compliance with the SDTC Act. So I would just, for the record, ask you to come back to this committee and determine whether you factored in or considered, with respect to conflicts of interest and non-compliance with the law by Ms. Mateau, not only $4 million that went to MindSense Technologies, but $7.1 million. In fact, maybe what I'll do is just get back to you with a list. Would you undertake to do that? Because when you calculated it, there's millions and millions of dollars more that went out the door.
Mr. Chair, the team will have to go back through the lots of details in our file in order to be able to answer that question, and we'll see what we can provide to the committee.
Turn it over to Mr. Perkins.
You got about 50 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to go back and ask a question on the issue of whether or not those companies, and I'll ask this to you, Mr. Booth, those companies that the Auditor General has determined were done under a conflict of interest. Well, actually, I'll start with the first group. There was $58 million that went to companies, according to the Auditor General, that were ineligible. They were outside of the parameters of the contribution agreements. Will you commit that no company will get further funding going forward in its new structure that is part of that group or any other group that was received money that is outside of the existing contribution agreements, as has happened under Annette Pasharian's chairmanship and these other Liberal appointees.
Mr. Chair, I have to admit, on the 13th day on the job, I'm not familiar with the details of the companies or the.
I'm sorry, Mr. Booth, but I wasn't asking for the particular companies. It's a general statement.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is my commitment, consistent with the Auditor General's report, is to go back and review all the companies that have received funding to make sure that it was appropriate, and in the cases where it was not appropriate, as identified by the Auditor General, to see what are the appropriate steps. So my commitment to you is that we will review all of the companies that receive funding, and as my colleague said, we'll start with the companies that have projects in process. So for the ones that have no problems, we can get that funding restarted. But my plan is, with my fellow board members, to review all the projects that have been funded.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shanahan, you're next for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Hogan, thank you for an excellent report, and I think it's kind of, how should I say, I know it's an unusual report in some respects, but in other respects, again, addresses some of the overriding themes that your office often looks at. Right, where it's a lack of documentation, whether deliberate or not deliberate, or governance structures that are not properly put in place. But I understand it's unusual because this is an arm's length organization. Typically, your office would be auditing government departments and Crown corporations. Can you just talk to us about the nature of the structure of this organization? What were the challenges for your office, if any, in doing the audit, and in particular that it's tied to a federal department, but is it, what did those ties look like? I'm also curious about what the oversight function was. What did you observe about that? Was there some kind of a regular check-in? I'm trying to get a good understanding of as to how SDTC operated in its early years.
Okay, there were many questions in there, and I'll try and answer them all. So, as you said, a foundation is another arm's length away from a Crown corporation from the federal government. So that in and itself usually would make it ineligible for my office to audit. We are not the auditors of the foundation. The reason we could go to the foundation is that it is funded solely by federal money, and it's that contribution agreement that existed between the Government of Canada and the foundation that gave me the conduit to go in and see whether or not public funds were spent in a prudent way. The ties to the department is that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada had oversight responsibility, or responsibility to monitor, I guess is the best way to describe it, compliance with that contribution agreement. And that compliance structure was actually set out in the contribution agreement. It wasn't just about receiving corporate plans, which they did receive, minutes, which they did receive, but that they should have been auditing compliance with the contribution agreement to make sure that public funds were being used in a prudent way. You asked about things that were unusual. I would tell you that relationship is an unusual one. It's usually quite unusual for a department to be so involved with an arm's length, even further arm's length organization than a Crown. But I would tell you that the corporate structure set up in the Sustainable Development Technology Act is an unusual one. The one where there is not only a board of directors, but a group of members that is meant to be self-sustaining and to appoint the members. So that is an unusual corporate structure, and we found that there was challenges in it being, in the act being respected. In fact, that was one of our findings, in that the board of directors of the foundation didn't ensure that the foundation continued to comply with aspects of their enabling legislation. So I think that I've covered off all of your elements, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because I think this is one of the outcomes of the work that you do is certainly learning. So I'm not sure if, I'd like to hear from perhaps Ms. Yuri or Mr. Booth. Maybe we'll hear from you later. But Ms. Yuri, what were, in your experience, what were the internal checks and balances in the review process of the projects? I mean, what did it look like to you? Did you have eyes on that?
Sure. So the approval process really starts at application for any company that's looking for funding. There's a screening process that essentially happens the full way through until it actually reaches the board for approval. So the board approvals and the committee approvals are very much the last step. There's a whole bunch of steps that happen in between prior to a project even getting to that point. So projects are screened for kind of a high level eligibility, whether they actually kind of meet the goals and objectives of the fund. Companies, if they pass that, they go into a video pitch session, and then there's further eligibility criteria applied. And the companies essentially do a pitch session of their company, of their project, who their partners are, how they plan to fund it, what the environmental benefits are associated with their project. At that point in time, a company may also be off-ramped if they make it through that step. Company then can move to a diligence process. As we go through diligence, there's significant interviews with the management team, deep dive review on the technology, discussions with their funding partners, discussions with their project partners, as well as expert or external reviewers that are engaged that provide an independent view on the criteria associated with eligibility for that project.
Providing the independent view?
It's external parties. Academics are some of the individuals that we engage. It's external consultants that review the project and opine on. One reviewer opines on the technical aspects of the project, and we have another reviewer that opines on the business aspects of the project. And every project goes through that review, as well as there's probably about 20 different folks within the SDTC organization at different points in time are involved in that review and are touching the file prior to that project ever being presented to the project review committee.
Thank you very much. Encore une fois, suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés pour seulement...
Madame Sinclair Gagné, 2 minutes and a half. Ms. Yuri, can you tell us what firm is going to be hired? You mentioned external auditors and to look at the technical and dimensions. What firm?
But enable us to kind of move a little bit more quickly to be able to address, I think, the pressing issue of getting funding going for some of the projects that have been kind of had their funding paused for a little while. We have been working with Deloitte as a partner to help us with our process and process enhancements. And so the plan is to trial that and ensure that they have the experts that we need to be able to conduct the review. It's a matter of finding the correct
Donc,
resources.
vous n'êtes pas passé par un appel d'offres, vous avez...
You haven't asked for any bids yet. You directly contacted Deloitte to do this review of the projects?
The engagement with Deloitte was conducted through an RFP, and that RFP process actually happened in the fall, and they've been assisting us, and there was a competitive process.
Excusez, mais je parle précisément de ce que vous décrivez.
But I'm speaking directly to what you describe. You say all projects will be vetted to see if they were eligible and are eligible. What firm is it that you will be using to do that for that volume of projects? Yes or no? Is it Deloitte?
So currently, what we're trying to understand is whether through Deloitte, who we have an engagement with currently to help us through the MRAP process, and that engagement was competitively bid, whether they have the resources to help us move quickly to be able to assess eligibility.
Allez-vous vérifier que les ressources chez Deloitte n'ont pas de conflit d'intérêt avec...
Are you going to be sure to verify that Deloitte isn't in conflict of interest in terms of its resources?
Encore une fois, c'est une question qui se répond.
Because once again, yes or no. There's a process for conflict of interest, and Deloitte as well could have conflict of interest with businesses that are part of its portfolio. So how are you going to determine whether or not projects are eligible but in
may have with the individual portfolio companies? That is a process that Deloitte engages in for every company that it reviews as part of our process. They have a risk management process that requires client acceptance review and ensuring that they have no conflicts, that is, no other consulting work, taxation work, and things of that nature prior to be able to do the review that we'd be asking
Le conflit d'intérêt que Deloitte...
But a conflict of interest in terms of Deloitte is with respect to SDTC. Yes, I work for Deloitte, and we know that the client engagement process is not is with a third party, not the hundreds of projects that you have underway. So what are your practices, and how are you going to ensure that there is no conflict of interest with the employees who will be working with Deloitte and at the same time the eligibility review?
Process that Deloitte goes through with the client that they engage. However, due to the number of companies that we have Deloitte reviewing, Deloitte has been going through the process of reviewing their conflict of interest for each individual company in our portfolio, and they cannot opine on the eligibility for those companies.
Thank you very much. Up next again, Mr. Green, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put two questions to you, Ms. Yuri, that are going to be yes or no questions. The first question is, does the contribution agreement require SDTC to transparently provide the public with its application criteria and funding streams so that anyone in the public can apply for funding?
Yes, that is an element of the
Did SDTC provide the public with any information or opportunity to apply for the funding through the Ecosystem Fund?
Not that I'm aware of.
Then how was the board chair of Versations Center selected for funding review in a fair manner if the public never had information about the fund's existence?
My understanding is the ecosystem stream was a pilot, and there was no, was a stream to be able to understand if there was an appetite or
Who
whether
created
there
the
was an
pilot?
ability. I believe it was an initiative of the former CEO.
The CEO created a pilot that
No,
fast-tracked its own
No.
project
The
through...
ecosystem stream
Correct.
was, to look for projects in that was an initiative of our former CEO.
Similarly, then, how was the CEO's Alice project selected for funding review in a fair manner if the public never had any information that these funds existed?
My understanding is the Alice project was referred to SDTC by Emissions Reduction Alberta, so it was from another funding agency.
Another funding agency presented it to SDTC for selection?
Correct.
Who selected it?
I don't know that.
You don't know?
I don't know the answer to that question. The ecosystem stream was very much a pilot. It was an attempt to see if there were projects that could fit what SDTC was delivering and providing greater benefits, environmental benefits to the
But that's not the question. The
ecosystem.
question I asked is, did the public have an opportunity for a fair procurement process or fair application process for public funds, or were these hand-selected with clear conflicts of interest to board members and people associated in senior management?
Again, I can only tell you it was a pilot.
Ms.
stream,
Hogan,
just the two.
based on what you've just heard as a characterization, is it fair to say that SDTC executives were giving preferential treatment in hand-selecting companies that were not eligible and broke the conflict of interest because they were connected to management and the board, while simultaneously none of these opportunities were presented to the general public?
Mr. Chair, what I can tell you about the ecosystem is what we wrote in paragraph 63 in our report, is that we found that innovation, science, and economic development had raised concerns with management that the ecosystems projects did not meet the contribution agreement, but we saw no evidence that management at the foundation had talked to the board about this. So I think there was a breakdown in communication here
Member's name.
about things that really were not eligible to be funded under the contribution.
But to be clear, the board chair's name was literally on the center receiving funding, correct?
I don't believe that that organization received funding. There were two organizations
Oh,
who
that's
received
right.
ecosystem funding.
Thank you.
My apologies. They tried to find them other funding somewhere else.
Thank you, Mr. Green. We'll certainly come back to you. Mr. Duncan, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Uri, I want to follow up. Earlier on in some of the lob questions back and forth from the Liberal side, you had said that this seed funding program you deemed to be very successful, a great success. And one of the frustrations was about the program was the criticism it's been receiving. I find that a little, frankly, tone deaf after the reason we're here is the Auditor General's report about the massive amount of corruption and conflict of interest that went around by Liberal insiders being appointed and improving themselves tens of millions of dollars. I'm going to say, as opposed to the criticism you've heard around this table or through the Auditor General's report, I'm going to suggest that might be a very strong feature as to why the program is rightfully getting a lot of criticism. But I want to follow up to what Mr. Perkins said earlier, asking about getting taxpayers' money returned from these projects that were deemed ineligible. You mentioned, we haven't done it yet. The government hasn't reached out. We haven't reached out to anybody to get any money back yet because you're evaluating it. There are 10 projects, for an example, that the Auditor General said worth $59 million that were not they were ineligible. They were not eligible for this money. What more do you need to study before asking them for the money back?
I think we need to develop a process to be enabled us to determine how to recover those funds and what the most appropriate mechanism is. And that's where we're looking at a path forward in assessing the eligibility of all the portfolio and moving forward with a consistent path forward so all of the companies are treated fairly.
And I'll go back, Mr. Booth, I want to ask you about this because not only were there the 10 projects worth $59 million deemed ineligible, there's the number of 90 cases, more than that, $76 million alone, where there was conflicts of interest that the Auditor General had highlighted in the selected area of review. In your opinion, in your job asking you to come in and clean up this corruption, if a board of directors member or there was a conflict of interest and money was approved, do you agree that that automatically makes them ineligible and that money should be returned by taxpayers?
Mr. Chair, I would say that, as I said before, I'm going to review with my two fellow board members all the projects and in any cases where money should be recovered.
So my question specifically, Mr. Booth, is in the case if there's a conflict of interest on the project where money was granted, is that ineligible and the money must come back to taxpayers? On conflict of interest, the Auditor General has selected a number, yes or no? Does the money come back?
I will assess the projects, and when I believe money should be recovered, if it can be recovered, I will recover it.
Well, I was going to say that the cleanup that's going to be required here might be a bit more of a light dusting if you can't commit that the Auditor General says that conflict of interest rules were not followed and was not appropriate. I'm just going to read right from the Act. I know you're new on the job in the last couple of weeks, but it's the seriousness and just actually, frankly, the simplicity of it, where the Act does state for conflict of interest. It says, for the purposes of this Act, a public office holder is in a conflict of interest when he or she exercises an official power, duty, or function that provides an opportunity to further his or her private interest or those of his or her relatives or friends. Decision-making, no public office holder shall make a decision or participate in making a decision related to the exercise of an official power, and can go on in many other parts that it's in an act in the Parliament of Canada. And you can't tell me just at a high level, I'm not giving a name or a number, but if somebody was found to have violated the Act and violated the conflict of interest rules, the Auditor General says there's at least 90 cases with $76 million. Do you not think Canadians might be frustrated in the work you're asked to come in and do and clean up? You can't even tell me that if you're in a conflict of interest, you knew the rules, you broke the rules and got the money, that money needs to come back for taxpayers. I'll ask you again, if they're in conflict of interest, they broke the rules of the Act, will that money be forced to come back to taxpayers?
As a deputy minister, one of the things I learned was not to give blanket assurances without a complete understanding of the facts. and I'm going to have to go. I completely accept the report of the Auditor General, and my main responsibility will be to implement her report. But to give any assurances about any companies before I understand the facts would be ill-advised, and I will not do it.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan, that is your time. We'll come back to you, I'm sure. Mr. Weiler, good to see you today. For joining us online, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I want to start with Ms. Uri. Just given some of the blatant conflict of interests that have been revealed here through the Auditor General's report and that we've been able to dive into a little bit more today, I was just hoping you could walk me through the process of how the ISED was reviewing the minutes to ensure that there is an oversight mechanism. And I'm just kind of curious how some of these cases were not identified up until this Auditor General's report.
So thank you for the question. I can tell you that for every board meeting, the department has provided all of the documents related to that board meeting. They also have accessible to them the documents for any of the committee meetings as well. And so ISED has provided these in advance of the meeting, so they would have the ability to review the materials provided as well as the minutes of the previous meeting, because that would be contained in those materials. I'm not don't work within the department, so I'd be unable to kind of respond to how they review them within the department, other than knowing that SDTC's board meetings regularly had a departmental representative observing at the meetings, not necessarily a participant, but generally there as an observer.
Thank you. Next, I want to ask a question to Mr. Booth. Given actually response from the Auditor General before, there was a concern raised about the transition from the arm's length setup that SDTCs had under the NRC, that there will be a challenge of potentially accessing some of the expertise in the clean tech sector. I was hoping you might be able to provide some information about how the NRC is going to be able to approach this challenge that's been identified to ensure that while this transition, or as this transition takes place, that you're not going to be losing that type of important expertise for being able to deliver this types of funding.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I listened carefully when the Auditor General made her remarks, and one part of them, and given I accept all the findings of her report, one part of them I found myself nodding my head to, and I thought, and that was the part where they talked about the legislation, which I find to be very complex and kind of bakes in the problem of conflicts of interest, because this is such a small sector, and yet you require all these experts to opine, and then board members, all with expertise in the sector, to decide. And so it strikes me that right back to the beginning of the legislation in 2001, this problem has been baked in. And I certainly would not recommend this kind of legislation to be passed, but that's all downriver. The other thing that caught my interest was her concern about, or at least identifying a risk that you would not, in a government department, be able to have the expertise, or at least given the more stringent conflict of interest rules that we as public servants dealt with. And the reason that I was maybe not as concerned about that risk is when I think back to my time as Deputy Minister for Environment Canada. I mean, I was the head, I supervised the Canadian Meteorological Service. I'm not a meteorologist. The Canadian Wildlife Service. I'm not a wildlife biologist. But the thing is that good deputy ministers are experts at managing experts. And so I think that we still have to ensure, NRC will still have to ensure that the expert opinions that they access, are free from conflicts, or conflicts are managed properly. So it doesn't completely make the problem go away. But it strikes me that the benefits are going to be, you're going to have a deputy minister that is very circumscribed in their own financial affairs and conflict of interest declarations. And you're going to have to rely on them to access the expertise that they need to make the decisions. So, it is a risk, but it's a risk certainly that deputy ministers, I think, face all the time.
Thank you very much. Beginning our third round, Mr. Perkins, you have the floor again for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll pick up there with you, Mr. Booth. You were a deputy minister of finance. You've got a distinguished career in the public service. SDTC had an ADM in every board meeting, every single board meeting that happened. Half of the transactions that those boards passed were conflicted. Half. Do you believe that ADM reporting to you would never tell you as the deputy minister that half of an $800 million fund of taxpayer money was being voted to the directors themselves, that he would never tell the deputy about that?
Mr. Chair, it's very difficult for me to say what the assistant deputy minister knew and what he reported to the deputy minister. I honestly don't know. But one of the things I will say is this goes back to what I just said about the legislation. Here, this is an arm's-length body.
Sorry, Mr. Booth. I didn't ask you about the legislation because there was not a single chair of this board since its establishment in 2001 that had a conflict. Not one, until Annette Basharian. And she was appointed over the objections of the senior management team who told the ADM, the deputy minister, and the minister's office that they shouldn't appoint a board member who's conflicted, yet they did. So it boggles my mind that we've had ministers here claiming, like Navdeep Bains doing his Sergeant Schultz routine, that he knew nothing. He doesn't remember anything. All he's responsible was for appointing corrupt liberals to the board. He wasn't responsible for overseeing the corrupt liberals to the board. It's appalling to me that everyone has said, it's not my fault. We just let it go on. And as a deputy minister, I would think you would be appalled by the fact, regardless of who the past was, that a deputy minister would sit here and say, I didn't know anything. I spent absolutely no time overseeing, when I had an ADM in every meeting, that I spent no time. Absolutely no time figuring out how they're doing it. It's beyond belief that an ADM sitting in every single one of these board meetings, unless it's because he was asking one of the previous chairs for a job outside of government, maybe he was conflicted. But it's incredible to think that we're going to get the same old stuff, the same old management, the same old approach, the same old whatever. Okay, they were legitimate companies and everyone's conflicted and everyone in this industry is conflicted. Half of all the transactions in the audit period had a problem. Half. So there's absolutely no way these 4 directors that did this are in control of all the companies in the entire green technology industry. It just happened that the half that they had an interest in managed to get through the system. Come on. It's a conspiracy of corruption and defrauding the taxpayer. And nobody in the government seems to care. No current minister, no current deputy minister, and you as a former deputy minister of finance don't seem to care, yet they put you in charge.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, is there a question?
Why are you not appalled by this? Surely in 2 weeks you've had the opportunity to look at some of this stuff in preparation for appearing today.
In preparation for my appearance today, I did quite a lot of things in the past 2 weeks, and I I prepared a list. I don't think the minister, the honourable member is asking that. I spent most of my time becoming familiar with the Auditor General's report. I haven't looked at any individual files yet, and I'm not ready to do that. But the one assurance that I will give you is that I will implement the Auditor General's report and to the best of my ability, and make sure that no funding goes forward that isn't compliant.
Okay, I appreciate that. The Auditor General, there's a fellow named Chris Wormold, and he was the business review analyst for this outside consultants. And he put forward reports, and we have copies of them, that said a number of these projects should not be approved and shouldn't be qualified under the funds. And then only within a couple of months, he put forward a report saying, oh, sorry, changed my mind. These should be approved. It happens that the ones that he changed his mind on were all financially owned by one of the directors. Did you, as the Auditor General, as part of the governance and analysts, understand and look in that depth at this fellow, Chris Wormold, and all of those things that were off the table and rejected, and then back on the table mysteriously, happen to be the ones the directors owned?
As I mentioned before, we don't look at the individual actions of a person. We went to the organization, but I believe that the honourable member is talking about a reference in paragraph 42, where we did highlight that there was an external expert who had a conflict and wasn't removed. Again, this is instances where the conflict of interest policy it didn't cover things or wasn't followed. And so I believe that we highlighted a couple of those situations in paragraph 42.
Thank you.
I can ask Mathieu to add if you would like more details. I don't know.
Go ahead.
In our sample, the companies that have been reviewed by this individual were in a sample, so we have review, but we did not expand the work with this person in our head. So we looked at what it was in a sample. The two companies you're talking about were in a sample, so this is how we picked up the situation.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you to the witnesses for coming again. Are you all right, Ms. Hogan? Okay.
I think I'm good.
All right, so that's fine. So maybe I'll turn to Mr. Booth instead. Are you involved in the employee?
Ms. Yip, I'm actually just going to suspend for 30 seconds to a minute. We wouldn't want to have one of our key witnesses distracted, so let's just hold on. I would suspend for 1 minute.
Okay.
I would not want to lose the auditor at the end of the session. Ms. Yip, you have the floor again for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'll give Ms. Hogan a bit of a break, and I'll turn to Mr. Booth. Are you involved in the employee transfers from SDTC to the NRC?
I'm not sure what you mean. Am I involved? I mean, as chair of the board, I will be involved, although I'm not leading the planning on the transfer of programming and staff to the NRC. That's one of my board colleagues.
Okay. Can you talk about how these transfers are happening, the number of employees that are being transferred over?
Well, first of all, SDTC is a pretty small organization in terms of staff. I think in the neighborhood of 75. So relatively small compared to the National Research Council. My sense is, I mean, the minister has already said that all the staff from SDTC will be offered employment at the NRC. But, of course, it remains to be seen how many of them decide that they want to take that up. And, in fact, I mean, this is one of the things that I've been thinking about. There's a lot of expertise there, and the folks in the NRC in our preliminary meeting recognize that. So, you know, one of the things that we're going to have to do is try to make sure that we don't have a big loss of expertise as the programming moves over to the council.
To your knowledge, why was it decided to be an important part of this new governance structure to transfer the existing employees to the NRC?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the question.
The question is, to your knowledge, why was it decided to be an important part of this transferring of employees as part of this new governance structure to the NRC?
You know, I can't say for sure what was in the minister's mind when he made this decision. Certainly, ministers get advice from their departments, but they also have other considerations that they have. I mean, I think that a move to the NRC and the Auditor General has alluded to this, does help deal with some of the conflict of interest issues because, you know, the public service has very clear and strict rules about this. I mean, I was a public office holder for many years, and I've experienced it myself. So, and certainly in terms of reporting and accounting, those things will be simplified a great deal with the transfer to the NRC. You know, the thing is that there are some synergies. The IRAP program has a lot in common with SCTC's programming. The people who work in it are in the field. Most of them are in the private sector or from the private sector. They deal with private sector companies, sometimes, you know, the same companies. So there are some synergies, and in our preliminary meeting, the NRC recognize that, but you know, it's going to be a complex process to move private sector folks into a public sector organization, and so there's lots of work to do.
Thank you. To Ms. Hogan, one observation that's been raised is the challenge of organizations like small clean tech companies in Canada are part of a small and closely linked ecosystem. What is your insight on how organizations that are operating in this type of ecosystem should conduct themselves to make sure all guidelines are being followed regardless of ethics and so forth?
I'm not sure that I have thoughts on what to tell all the small organizations in the clean tech industry. What I was looking at was how the foundation was managing those conflicts of interest, and you know, I truly believe that inherent in the SCT Act was an inherent conflict, right? Ensuring that the board members have the expertise in such a small niche market was just bringing inherent conflicts, and that's why I would have expected a much more rigorous process around managing those conflicts of interest. It was difficult at best to go through many series of minutes to see where a conflict was declared, and then to be able to trace whether someone had then voted or participated in a conversation about a company where they were conflicted. It was clear that not having a system to manage that is what caused many of these conflict of interest issues. So I think it's about making sure there's rigor, especially when public funds are involved.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. Having sat on this committee before, it was often the case that the auditor would come independent of the witnesses in separate hours. When that occurred, it allowed for a reset of the rounds to give the opposition parties the opportunity to have a full round of questioning at the top of the hour. So I'm just going to test the will of the room and see if I could get unanimous consent to allow the block and myself to have our full 5-minute intervention.
Well, I'll just speak to that. That has, I'm not aware of that. I've been chairing for more than 2 years. That's never even been brought up before now. I have been giving members, certainly you've had good questions, extra time. We will seek if there is. So hold on. We're in the middle of a round right now, so I'm more inclined to.
It's the start of the hour.
Well, again, Mr. Green, you're proposing something that's never been brought up in subcommittee. This is the first I've ever heard of this. My experience is the auditor appears with the witnesses, never separate. So I'll put that aside. I hear your request. It is basically to to truncate the last round to.
To give us back our 5 minutes.
No, Mr. Green, you've not lost anything. You say you're giving back, but as I said, what you're asking has never been done under my chairmanship, and no party has ever raised it, not even yours. So yes. Anyway,
you have consent from me to allow the extra time.
So just give me a second here. So is there UC to give the NDP in the block minutes go 2.5 to 5 minutes for this turn? All right. So, Mr. Green, so you know this is a collaborative committee, and we often do give the two third parties more time. But I'm just pointing out what you're recommending. I've never heard of here, and in fact, my understanding is the auditor always appears with the witnesses and never alone. Is that your experience too, Ms. Hogan?
So I have to admit, I can talk about my experience over 4 years, and typically we very much prefer to be here with the parties involved in our audit, yes.
Thank you. Madame Sinclair-Gagné, vous avez la parole pour 5 minutes.
Madame Sinclair-Gagné, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Green, for your intervention, and I certainly support what he said. Ms. Hogan. Your office sent us a supplementary document at the request of our colleagues where I see that the amounts that are associated with eligible projects were violated as $58 million for projects where the modalities of the contributions remain unverified as to whether or not they were eligible. Can you tell us what these projects were? There were cases where some of the projects overlapped, and these were the projects. What is SEED? Yes, in the SEED funding where it didn't match the contribution, and also with respect to the COVID ones as well. So they were dealt with as a group rather than on a case-by-case basis. And that runs counter to the agreement with the government. Give us some specific examples, please, if you can, in terms of the seeding or of the startups. Can you give some examples? Yeah, I'll ask Matthew. He can do it. In the case of the COVID payments, there were 2 payments in 2020 and 2021. 118 projects in 2020 were approved, and in 2021, it was 111 projects. So you are saying that these projects were approved all at one time as a block without scrutiny. So as to the projects that were approved outside of COVID, well, the seed projects were not looked at individually, but they were just grouped together as seed up projects. Well, why did you do that? To approve them at the same time? Well, the process for the seed projects was different depending on the foundation. and that means then, according to the foundation, that the seeding process did not follow what was in the agreement. How many of them were there? How many did you say? 191. 94, rather. So for the a mass approval of 194 at one single time were approved. Yes, if there were about 15 other streams, you're saying? Well, I don't have it really in mind completely, but yes. Well, can you give us this information in writing so that we can keep it in our files? Because this is something that is 12 streams. Okay, all right, 12 streams. So about 20 projects in other streams. Do you have an explanation then? You say the projects were different, but I mean, what explanation was given for that fact? Was it a reasonable explanation, or are there reasonable explanations at all? This is a question to ask of the director of the foundation, and the team. It represents about $112 million that was tied to the process of approval. You're saying that this $112 million was seen as an amount that was too small to proceed with the necessary vetting of eligibility. So it was just too small an amount. Is that what you're saying? Well, with the evaluation of the risk with respect to $100 million is much smaller than vetting the risks associated with much larger amounts. Well, there is some $19.5 million were spent in that way without any type of checkup. How much time do I have, sir? It goes fast. Time goes fast. Thank you. Well, could I ask you to come back to us? I don't want to give you extra work. I'm sorry. But could you perhaps put this in writing and come back to us with it? Without the 96 cases that were followed, I'm very much interested in the projects of conflict of interest that were in conflict of interest that weren't followed up. Those are the ones I am most interested in, the categories in which you found that there was overlap. Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you 2 yes or no questions, Ms. Yuri, and I'd like you to answer them before I move on. Does the contribution agreement require SDTC to review financial compliance and fully complete a project budget for an approval?
Yes, it does.
Would SDTC executives recommend a project to the board if there were concerns of financial noncompliance and incomplete budgets?
I don't believe so.
Why then were the financial concerns of noncompliance relating to the ALIS ecosystem ignored?
I don't believe that there were concerns around financial noncompliance with the ALIS ecosystem project. ALIS had proposed a project to help remediate the soil.
What about more broadly with ecosystems? Did you ever have any concerns about financial noncompliance with the ecosystem projects?
Anytime that there is a concern around financial compliance, it's ensuring that we're funding an appropriate project budget.
Ms. Yuri, I'm going to reference to you an email that you sent to Christine Charbonneau dated February 24th, 2022. In it, you said, subject line DD number 4, February 22nd, question. Hi there. Attached is a summary of the expenses that are planned for the ecosystem project that is being proposed for potentially 2022B. You may recall this. You said it is a challenge to ensure compliance as there is no clear project identified. Do you recall that email?
And that's, I was about to respond. And so the concern with all projects is ensuring that we have a project that's clearly defined. And so I had expressed my concerns around the ALIS project and that we need to ensure that we have an appropriate budget for the project and understand those costs. That
At any time, did you ever have SDT staff working to ensure that there were appropriate budgets and compliances for companies that had applied that didn't meet that standard?
Every budget is reviewed that comes into the organization.
Is it common to have staff within SDTC work proactively for an organization to help create budgets and compliance?
I don't believe that
Okay,
SDTC creates
so-
budgets for.
So
the
that's never
projects.
happened? You've never had staff work on a project to help bring somebody into compliance? Is that what your testimony today?
No. So what happens with budgets that come into the organization is budgets are received from the companies. The budgets are reviewed, and part of that review is to ensure that the companies understand the eligibility requirements of the fund. We don't want budgets coming in that have ineligible costs.
Is it common
or
practice
that
to have
don't-
staff work on proactively, after the case, after the approval, retroactively, I should say, compliance? It's just a simple question, yes or no. Is it common to have them work on projects?
If there's budgets that have, or if there's reporting that comes back from companies that is not within our eligible cost buckets and is not clearly within the scope of the project, then yes, we would have, as part of our review process, we would be informing the company that they need to.
And then you would have your staff work on it?
There would be, within our finance organization, folks that would address those issues.
Ms. Yuri, why did the SDC board and executive team approve the Alice ecosystem and give them $5 million in tax-paying money when it was conflicted with the CEO, it was ineligible, had no budget or compliance, and especially when other companies never give this type of preferential treatment?
So my understanding for the Alice project was that any conflicts that were associated with that project were declared, adjudicated, and a decision was made on who could participate in those votes.
This is, granted, we've already established this is a special fund for which no public advertising or opportunity was given to people outside of those that were insiders and connected to board members. So have you ever, as an executive, knowingly ignored financial noncompliance for companies that successfully received money?
No, I've never ignored financial noncompliance. All projects require a budget and eligible expense review, and that's prior to any funds being dispersed.
So Section 671 of the auditor's report identifies that COVID-19 dollars were paid out without ensuring that there was a process to award such payments complied with contribution agreements. What would the risk would the recipient companies be in if they were in breach of their contribution agreements?
So prior to, I think, providing any type of COVID support, there was a review of all the companies.
Did you ever knowingly provide COVID support to companies you knew would automatically be in breach of financial compliance, i.e. be overfunded? Did you ever do that?
There was I can tell you for the assessment process that I was involved in, there was a review of funding ratios of the companies.
75% is the appropriate ratio?
It will 50% for the SDTC funding
Right.
ratio and 75% for the company.
Were there companies that ever came in at 78%?
If there was any company, so what happens with our funding is there's always a holdback. So each disbursement that's provided, there's 10% that's
Did the
withheld.
companies know that in receiving the
Thank
COVID
you. I'm
funding,
afraid
they
that
would be
is
in
your
breach of their
time,
agreements?
Mr. Green. I'll allow a quick response from Ms. Yuri.
As far as I was aware, that we wouldn't have been providing funding to companies that would have put them in breach of their funding ratios.
Thank you. Turning now to Mr. Cooper. You have the floor for 5 minutes, Mr. Cooper.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, are you satisfied with responses from SDTC and the department about how they are dealing with ineligible projects?
The organizations agreed with my recommendation, and I think I've been clear in the past about if there is any funding that has been given to an individual or an organization that is ineligible, I would expect that the government will take action to recover that. And if they do not plan to do so, I would expect them to be clear and transparent with Canadians about why.
You're not fully satisfied.
Well, I haven't seen them take any action yet, but they've
Okay,
agreed
well,
with my recommendation, so it'll be time to see, time will tell how they implement the recommendation.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Ms. Yuri, in the last fiscal year, how much did SDTC board members and the chair receive in bonuses?
In the last fiscal year, board members don't receive bonuses. How much did
the CEO receive? How much did executive members receive in the way of bonuses?
This past fiscal year, no bonuses have been paid to executive team.
This is okay. In 2021, it was confirmed that the CEO received bonuses in the amount of $96,000. VPs received bonuses of $48,000. I'm talking about for each VP, and each board member. You said board members don't receive bonuses. They received $11,000 in bonuses. Each and every board member. We're talking about that's hundreds of thousands of dollars in bonuses. Can you confirm that bonuses were awarded on the basis of meeting funding goals? In other words, getting money out the door.
The performance, pay for performance framework that we follow at SDTC is linked to corporate performance, which starts with the corporate plan. And so objectives are set for the year within the corporate plan.
That would include getting money out the door, correct?
There are a number of initiatives, including
supporting the ecosystem. I asked if that was one of the criteria, yes or no. And you know the answer to that, and the answer is yes, but I'm going to put it to you to put that on the record.
But yes, disbursements to companies that have been approved are one of the targets for the year.
That's right. And so what we have is $319 million that were funneled by board members to companies that they had an interest in, which violated the law, which were blatant conflicts of interest, outright corruption, so that they in turn could meet bonus eligibility criteria, so that, guess what, they could pad their pockets with even more money. Now, I would characterize that as an absolute racket. It is corruption on a scale that I don't know what it's comparable to. It makes the sponsorship scandal look small by comparison. And Ms. Uri, you signed off on the checks, right? You were Vice President of Finance at the time. You are now.
I wasn't Vice President of Finance at the time. I've been Vice President of Finance for about 18 months.
Were you You were CFO?
No, I was an employee of the organization.
In finance?
Some of the time in finance, yes.
I want to ask you about Cycle Capital. SDTC has funded Cycle Capital. It's received somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million to Cycle Capital. This is a company that Minister Guilbeault is a major shareholder in. He had also worked as a lobbyist for Cycle Capital. It happens to be, the managing partner happens to be none other than Andre Lise.
I'll need a question, Mr. Cooper, please.
Marteau. Do you think it did, of $17 million went out the door to Cycle Capital while Minister Guilbeault served in cabinet? Did anyone at SDTC think that maybe that wasn't a good idea? Maybe that might be problematic, that a company that the Minister of the Environment had an interest in was receiving $17 million in funding from SDTC?
All I can tell you regarding that is SDTC has never provided funding to Cycle Capital. It's not a company that SDTC provides funding
to its companies.
Gentlemen, that is the time. Thank you for that response. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to direct my questions to the new witnesses regarding the transitional process. Mr. Booth, as a transitional board member, what does your role look like? And are you intending or expecting to be part of the leadership or executive once the transition of SDTC to NRC has been completed?
Mr. Chair, I don't know if it's appropriate to reveal this, but I am 70 years old. And my term is for 1 year. And I'm kind of hoping that we can complete this task in less than a year. And that will end my involvement with this process. So I have no intention or interest in an ongoing role with STTC or the NRC. And in fact, I think if I understand correctly the process that we will have to follow, the last thing I will do is apply to dissolve the foundation.
Okay, that kind of leads me to my next question. Could you outline the timeline and key milestones for the transition of SDTC operations to the NRC? And what role will the transitional board play in overseeing the process? And again, how exactly will the SDTC employees be integrated into the NRC structure?
Mr. Chair, I have to say that the answers to those questions are all at the end of the planning process, not at the beginning, the planning process that we're just embarking on. I mean, I've told you that we have divided the work among the three directors, and the two that aren't here visiting with the committee are actually in Ottawa trying to advance that work. And so the planning of the transition on the SDTC side is internal planning is starting today in the SDTC offices, and the plan is to start the preliminary meetings with the National Research Council next week. But as far as concrete timelines in terms of what time or when employees will transfer, all I can say is my plan is that will be in a year or less, and from my point of view, the sooner the better.
Ms. Yuri, as the Vice President of Finance, how will your role as a board member change throughout this transition?
I believe that my role in the transition is very much to help support the work that we need to do to be able to prepare the organization, to be able to have a seamless transition into the National Research Council. I'm here to essentially kind of, I think, provide guidance to staff to help them through the process, as well as ensuring that we're kind of following an appropriate transition budget and make the move as smooth as possible. More importantly, during this time is to try to get our disbursements to our active portfolio of companies back up and running. And so that includes the work around assessing eligibility of projects and ensuring that we're still supporting the companies within the portfolio.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Mr. Booth. How will the transition contribute to enhancing the accountability and transparency in funding and support for clean technology initiatives?
Well, I think in two ways. First of all, even though we're working to transition programming and funding to the NRC, we're still implementing the Auditor General's report. So, strengthened record keeping, strengthened conflict of interest processes, all of those things will travel with the programming to the NRC. Now, they'll have to be modified because they'll land in a government department, which is a different structure. But I think a lot of them can be used because we're still going to have to access expert advice and conflict of interest has to be managed there, and the other thing is the future staff, the NRC staff that work on SDTC funding or clean tech funding will still have to be mindful and careful in managing potential perceived or real conflicts that they have. So, I mean, I think that going to a government department will help, accountability, and I've already talked about that, but also the work that we're doing to implement the Auditor General's report will help the NRC do a good job of clean tech funding in the future.
And given the emphasis on rebuilding public trust and enhancing accountability, which has been damaged, what measures are being put in place to communicate these improvements effectively to stakeholders and the general public?
Perkins, Cooper.
I don't.
Who's next?
I don't have an answer for that yet. Right now, we're focusing on communications with staff because this is a big change for them. But the next step is to talk with stakeholders. Stakeholders are very anxious, obviously, and I'll be honest, I haven't turned my mind to communication with the public. As a deputy minister, my thought was always that was the job of ministers to do that and not public servants. But this is a new role I'm in, and I'll certainly add that to my list of things to ponder.
Thank you very much. That is the time. And pardon me, I had a mic open there when I asked a sidebar question. Beginning our last round, Mr. Perkins, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Uri, I'd like to follow up on the question on bonuses. So you said none were paid this year. Were any bonuses paid the year before, last year? So that would be 2022.
In the previous fiscal year, yes, bonuses.
And how much were they?
I believe it's actually publicly available in the annual report that's on our website, and so it would vary depending on the level of the employee.
Can you table with this committee during the period of the time of the audit, 2017 through 2023, the bonuses paid to each individual executive, as well as any other additional compensation in that period of time they may have been given besides performance pay?
We should be able to table that without problem.
Thank you. Auditor General, I know your audit only went back to 2017. I would have been happy if it went back further, but I just want to outline to you why, and there was a mention earlier about Cycle Capital, and they don't pay. They don't pay Cycle Capital. Cycle Capital is a venture capital firm and owns a lot of companies, has ownership in a lot of companies. And if we go back to the establishment of Cycle Capital in 2009, and including your report, the companies that they are listed to have ownership in got $213 million, a considerable amount of the $1 billion Green Slush Fund. And after receiving the first $100 million, their founder owner was appointed to the board in 2016 as already having companies she had invested in having $100 million. The appointments process seems to be very flawed when somebody whose investments had already received $100 million was seen as a reasonable director for this board. Wouldn't you agree?
I can't comment on how board members were appointed. I didn't look at that during our audit.
But you don't think it's a problem that somebody gets appointed to a board her companies have received $100 million from the very board that she's being appointed to?
So as I mentioned, I think the Sustainable Development Technology Act had this inherent conflict of interest just baked into it. I would have expected that that would have been factored into an appointment process, and that if conflict of interest existed, whether the real or perceived, that they would have been better managed than what we found.
Look, it's very clear in the Act, both the SDTC Act and both the Conflict of Interest Act for public office holders, that you're not to benefit directly, you or your family, from the work of the organization as a public office holder you've been appointed to. And while given the list that you gave, and this is only what I've been able to find, the list that you gave us after the last meeting combined with the work I had done, there's $105 million that went to Cycle Capital alone during the time Cycle Capital's companies, during the time she was on the board from 2016 to 2023. Your audit's 2017 to 2023. It seems to have missed quite a bit of the conflicted companies that she got money to.
It's my understanding that the individual in question left the board, I think, earlier in 2020, 21. I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, when we approached this, we weren't looking at targeting individuals. We went in to see the process that the foundation had in place, and we found significant lapses.
I know, I
in
wasn't
how they
asking
managed
about an
conflicts of
individual, but
interest.
one would assume when an auditor went in and saw that over $200 million, or at least $100 million while she was on the board, went to companies that one director was gone, that might raise a flag and that somebody might have said something. But with that in mind, I would like to, Mr. Chair, move a motion if I could. I already did that earlier, Martin. I already did that,
Just
Mr.
one second, Mr. Perkins, before you begin, and you do have the floor, could I ask, have you sent the motion to the...
It's been sent.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
So I have forwarded the motion to the clerk to distribute to members. Given the Auditor General's audit of Sustainable Development and Technology Canada, and given the government-appointed board members approved, A, $59 million towards 10 ineligible projects, B, $76 million towards 90 projects in which board members had conflicts of interest and violated internal conflict of interest policies. I would add to that, and the SDTC Act. $259 million towards 96 projects where board members held conflicts of interest. D, $58 million towards projects without ensuring the contribution agreement terms were met. The committee therefore expressed extreme concern with the blatant disregard of taxpayer funds and therefore calls on the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry to recoup these funds for Canadian taxpayers within 100 days following the adoption of this motion, that the committee report this matter to the House.
Mr. Perkins, just 1 second. You'll be able to speak to this. When you reading that out, you said, and I would add, and you added a few words. Were those words in the motion you sent to the clerk?
We can,
Well, I need, once it's sent, the motion is out there. So
well, however you want to do it,
I would like you to tell me right now if you added a few words verbally that you would like added to the motion that was sent to the clerk.
in B, in violation of internal conflict of interest policies is how it reads now, and I would say, and in violation of the SDTC Act.
Chair, if I
Thank
may.
you. Yes.
Just on that, perhaps we should suspend so that we can all
I'm
have clear
going to do
language.
that. That was my next step, was to get it to you before we speak to it. So, but I wanted to clarify it because he said one thing, and I believed he had sent something else in. So just give me a second, and we'll get this sorted out. I will suspend for a minute. I'm going to call the meeting back into order, please. Before I turn the floor over to Mr. Perkins, I do want to first thank our witnesses for coming in today and your excuse, please. So I'll let you get on with your evening, and we'll continue with the committee business here. But we don't need you here for this. So, the motion has been circulated, and well, Mr. Perkins, I'm not worried about you. It's your motion. It will come very quickly, and you have the floor, please. Very good.
I don't want to prolong the evening. So in terms of the motion, I think the motion is self-evident. We've had a lot of discussion over a number of meetings. The Auditor General's report is very clear that there's almost half the transactions in that 5-year period were conflicted. There's no way 4 directors represented half the odds statistically of the entire industry, and it was just a fluke that half of what got done out of the $1 billion slush fund just happened to go to their companies. It's very clear that the evidence and trail is that there was a massive influence by these Liberal directors right down through the system, even having their rejected projects resubmitted so that they could be funded, and funded in funds set up by the board outside, completely outside of the terms that Parliament gave the money to the fund. So we want the money paid back. This was given to companies who had undue insider track, were given favoritism by Liberal appointed directors from the Prime Minister, and they used it to feather their own bank accounts and profit from the taxpayer. They broke 2 acts of Parliament. They broke the Conflict of Interest Act for public office holders, which says that you cannot take on a public office position and benefit from it personally, other than the small stipend you may get for serving on that board of a couple $100 a month. You cannot profit from it, neither you nor family. The SDTC Act itself says you cannot and your family cannot profit from the decisions of the board. Not your decisions, the decisions of the board on the organization when you're on that board. You cannot profit from it. It doesn't say if you recuse yourself from the room, it's okay to profit from the decisions of the board. Well, you vote for mine, and I vote for yours, and he votes for his, and it's all one happy family giving each other money. It's clearly a clear conspiracy, which is why it's being turned over to the RCMP, conspiracy to commit fraud on the taxpayer for the personal benefit of board members. So the items of the 186 conflicted, the 10 that were clearly outside that the Auditor General, to me, that money needs to be repaid. It's an abuse of the taxpayer for personal benefit of Liberal insiders. And that's why we've moved this motion. And we think it's not difficult. The list is there. The Auditor General has it. The amount of money's had it. It's not as complicated as people say. They got the money under circumstances that weren't warranted, and it should be repaid.
Thank you very much. Ms. Khalid, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I find it actually quite telling that we are receiving this surprise motion after the House has risen for the summer. And in what has been a consistent, blatant attempt to try to malign, to try to disregard what our public service is, and to try to connect and corrode what is the value of democratic institutions. And I say this because the text of the motion, including the language that the Conservatives continue to use day in and day out, trying to say, oh, the Liberals this and the Liberal government this, when the reality of the matter is the majority of these folks were appointed by their government 10 years ago. Please don't talk over me. I didn't talk over you, buddy. Don't talk over me. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Perkins, Ms. Khalid has the floor. You have the right to add yourself to the list again for speaking.
Don't do
order.
it. Oh, well,
so please,
thank you so much,
again,
Chair,
we have
for your
translators
intervention.
here to concern ourselves with. Ms. Khalid, you have the floor, and we'll keep this meeting orderly. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. And, just on that, I take issue with the amount of misinformation, disinformation that the Conservatives are plugging through committees, not this one, and across our Parliament, in the House of Commons, across social media, and everywhere, trying to really profit off of the politics of agitation. And I really would like, and I see that they're smirking there and laughing at each other. It's great. I am here all night, and I'm more than willing to talk this out and to really understand the objectives of why we are here and why we are doing what we're doing. And when I look at this text of this motion, Mr. Chair, what really concerns me is how desperate the Conservatives are right now to try to link any type of scandal with the government, to call on the minister to recoup funds. And absolutely, taxpayer dollars need to be accountable and accounted for, and that's the purpose of this committee. I 100% agree. But to do it in this manner that the Conservatives are doing right now, it is quite questionable, or as my friend Michael Cooper would say, it's highly suspicious. So what I'm trying to get at here, Mr. Chair, is that I think that we need to really understand whether the minister has the ability to go and recoup these funds, as the motion states, whether our committee has the ability to call on the minister to go and recoup these funds. We have a list that is outlined in this motion of funds. I would personally like to see where those numbers came from, and I think that we should be able to have that discussion to see what comes next. And the role of our committee, Mr. Chair, is not to be punitive to individuals or to go on a witch hunt exercises or to be the judiciary. The role of our committee is to find and review the Auditor General's reports and to find better ways in how the Parliament and the government can be better accountable to the public on its spending of taxpayer dollars. What has happened here, as I'm reading the recommendations of the Auditor General, is that there needs to be better due diligence. There needs to be better accountability with an organization. And there needs to be a big differentiation between people and organization. And we cannot and should not be maligning our government, our public service, for the faults of a few bad apples. What we should be doing is focusing on how we can improve the process, and that is what the role of our committee is. We should be focusing on how we can make sure that we are doing our best to improve the processes, to make sure that the recommendations of the Auditor General are being implemented by the various agencies that she has audited. And SDTC is one of them. In fact, I'm just reading here a report reference number 6.26. The recommendation of the Auditor General is, building on a recommendation made in 2017 by the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development Technology Canada, should develop its challenge function over projected sustainable development and environmental benefits. And the SDTC response was that it partially agreed. SDTC employs, as is said in this response, SDTC employs a robust process to quantify projected potential environmental benefits across 12 impact areas at 3 different points during a project life cycle. The process follows recognized standards. A 2018 ISED evaluation found that SDTC had a substantial review and challenge process for assessing proposed environmental benefits in project proposals. During due diligence, the best information available is used to quantify environmental impacts and is thoroughly reviewed and challenged by SDTC staff trained in environmental benefits quantification. After approval, SDTC uses external experts to quantify benefits and refine estimates to 2 additional times as the project progresses. Inherent uncertainties exist in projecting the environmental benefits of novel pre-commercial technologies. Information is often limited and involves estimating impacts 10 to 15 years into the future. Substantial increases or decreases in estimated benefits are expected as the technology gets closer to commercialization. Now, the milestones that have been described in this report, I find, are something that we need to explore more as a committee. And those milestones are, as SDTC says, that it will further strengthen its due diligence documentation to clearly outline the environmental benefits challenge function process. Now, if this motion had not moved, I would have loved to talk to the SDT folks about specifically what they mean by that. And then they gave themselves a deadline of September 2024 of achieving this milestone. They continue to say December 2024, SDTC will implement the enhanced processes, including any enhanced environmental benefit challenge function process. And I think, Chair, like with having gone through this report, what really matters in this committee, and I think what really is the function of this committee, is not to be a judiciary, is not to dictate or demand. It is to make recommendations based on testimony that we have heard from the Auditor General, from the relevant departments, about how we can improve the processes of our public service, of how taxpayer dollars are spent, and how we can continue to work together in a better way amongst ourselves to make sure that we are holding the government to account. The biggest challenge that I have, Chair, is that when we bring in partisan politics and shenanigans into the Public Accounts Committee, what we are doing is that we are derailing the important work of the Auditor General, the important work of each and every one of us individually and collectively here as a committee. When we take the politics out of the work that we're doing, we will be more successful. We will continue to build better trust in our democratic institutions. At this point in time, though, with this motion, I know exactly what the objectives are. And those are not in... I love that you're heckling at me, Mr. Perkins. It's quite unfortunate. As I was saying, and as you have proved my point, Mr. Perkins, that we need to take the partisan politics out of it. We need to ensure that the work of the committee is continuing in a proper function, in a proper manner, to make sure that we are achieving the objectives of this. I know exactly what the Conservatives are trying to do. They have looked under every rock, every stone, and...
Just a point of order, Ms. Khalid. Yes, Mr. Perkins.
I don't think that Liberal member is psychic and understands all the intricacies of
Mr.
the internal
Perkins, that is not a
operations of the
point of
Conservative
order.
Party.
I have another
If she
point
would like
of
to,
order.
she should join, and then she would understand why.
Oh, pardon me. Ms. Khalid, pardon me. Is it point of order? Ms. Khalid, you have the floor again.
Thank you, Chair. And as much as I've been disrespected by members of that party, I will continue to talk about what matters to Canadians. And what we are doing here this evening is using our Parliament, House of Commons resources to push forward a narrative by the Conservatives to say, ooh, look, it's a scandal. Oh, look, something is wrong here. Oh, look, and that member across the way who is continuing to chirp has said, this is a conspiracy, and the conspiracy continues. Well, you know what? We need to be better for Canadians. This is the Public Accounts Committee, and we need to find better ways to build consensus and to find ways in which we can review the work of the government. And when I say government, and you will have noticed, I did not say the Liberal government. It is governments preceding and governments in the future as well, and hold all of that to account. And if we are not able to do that, if we start, as I have seen over these past number of months and years, start using committees to push forward these conspiracies, I think we're in trouble. I think our country is in trouble with that kind of narrative. The politics of agitation is the biggest corroder
of order.
Our democracy.
Yes, Mr. Duncan, point of order.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I don't know, the Auditor General was just here. We're talking about her report, and Ms. Khalid just referred to conspiracy. She's suggesting that the Auditor General, or witness we had here, is up to conspiracy theories?
That is a comment,
so
not a point of
decorum
order.
Of the Auditor General. I mean, it's completely disrespectful to her.
You'll be able to point that out if you'd like me to add you to the list here. Ms. Khalid, you have the...
Disrespect to the Auditor General.
Ms. Khalid, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I will correct Mr. Duncan. When I was referring to conspiracy theories, those were words that I quoted that were said by Mr. Perkins, who was pushing that narrative, not the Auditor General. I have a lot of love and respect for her and the work that she does. Chair, I'm not sure why the Conservatives are chirping at me right now. It's quite unfortunate. I mean, we're trying to get work done here, right? And I'm here all night to continue to make sure that we push forward whatever objective it is that we're trying to push forward. I am not. I am trying to get my point across here.
Order.
Put your mic on and say that.
Order.
Let it go to a vote, then, and we'll see how it goes.
Mr. Perkins, Ms. Khalid, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And as much as Mr. Perkins would like to bully me into submission right now, I will not listen. I will continue. Chair.
Mr. Perkins, I have a list to get through here. You're even on it. The less you talk, the sooner we'll get to you, Ms. Khalid.
Chair, I would like your confirmation that Mr. Perkins will not interrupt me again as I continue to speak.
I don't have the ability to give that confirmation. I just try to maintain.
Okay, well, Mr. Chair, as you had said,
Ms. Khalid, you have the
there
floor.
is a speaking list, and if Mr. Perkins has contributions to make,
point of order.
I would appreciate that he would get on that list rather than.
1 second, Ms. Khalid. Yes, Mr. Perkins.
I didn't realize MP Khalid was the chair in determining the speaking order.
Mr. Perkins, as I said, Ms. Khalid has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Now, as I was saying, the objective of this motion seems to be very clear. We have been having meetings on this issue in a respectable way, trying to understand what happened, what went wrong, and working through the Auditor General's reports and finding solid ways in which we can ensure that organizations like this are accountable and are steady in the work that they do and are achieving the objectives for which they were created. Now, the objective of this motion, I think, is quite clear. Do it again. Please, Chair Pepe. Go ahead.
Mr. Perkins.
Go ahead.
Mr. Perkins. Mr. Perkins. If you just cool your jets, you will get a chance to speak. Ms. Clete, I'm not hearing any talking. Are you done
I am
comment?
contemplating, Chair, as to how much longer can somebody chirp at me while I'm trying to get my point across here. I usually, I will say that not always, but I usually give respect to all of my colleagues, regardless of what side of the aisle they sit on. And I try my very best to listen and to understand their points of view. And it is quite disrespectful for members to be yelling across the way, to throw me off of the points that I'm trying to make in discussing a motion that was put forward while we had witnesses here that I had questions for on this exact issue, to help understand how the recommendations that I have been talking about are being implemented by this organization, to help understand what processes they have gone through to make sure that what has happened does not impact the credibility or the trust that Canadians would have in our democratic institutions, including this one. We know just how important climate change is. We know just how important it is to ensure that clean tech has the advantage that they need to be world leaders from Canadian companies to be able to combat what is the biggest challenge of our lifetime. So what I don't understand is why members opposite are trying to muzzle me or trying to chirp at me, trying to bully into submission, or whatever it is that they're trying to do. I oftentimes don't like what they have to say either. But that doesn't mean that I stare them down, as members are doing right now, or that I talk over them, or that I yell and scream, or find ways to just, end what is a healthy conversation and debate. So I will get back to my point, Mr. Chair, and I'm hoping that members opposite will listen, because what I do propose is an alternative viewpoint. And I think it is possible for us to disagree on viewpoints, have conversations, and then come together in a consensus or collaborative way without being disagreeable, without having to chirp at each other, without having to put each other down. I think it's very possible. And Mr. Perkins is a very respectable and honorable member of Parliament who serves his community very... who serves his community very, very well, and I would disagree with Mr. Green on that. I think that Mr. Perkins is indeed a very honourable member, and he is quite passionate, and he does care, and I would hope that he would appreciate that regardless of which party we belong to, here on this committee, we are trying our very best to do what is right for Canadians, to make sure that there is accountability. And the best way for us to do that is to take the partisanship out of it, folks. And what this motion is showing us is that the partisanship is continuing to just percolate here. And I think that we need to do better than that. I think that here, as the House has risen yesterday.
Point of order.
Yes, Mr. Duncan.
I just want to make sure Ms. Scalia has a lot to say on the motion at hand here that Mr. Perkins has put forward, and I want to respect that. I'm just wondering if we can confirm that resources will be available until what period of time to make sure Ms. Scalia can take the floor express her thoughts on this, and the others that have their hand up can also get to this.
So I run the clock like a European soccer referee. Members are welcome to talk and talk and talk until we collapse for a vote or we run out of time. Ms. Khalid has the
floor. Sorry, Chair, I know that members of our team are asking if you're going to be bringing in dinner.
You know the answer to that.
Point of order. Could we just make sure it's not $220,000 worth over 6 days, perhaps? And then we might be good.
And make sure it's not butter chicken, Chair.
We're out of resources. This meeting is adjourned.